Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today I wanted to do a little bit of a kind of follow-up and wrap-up to the recent tarot practice evolution and decluttering videos that I did last month. I wanted to kind of follow up with when I declutter or cull my collection, kind of how I'm approaching that these days, which is really not about getting rid of things, but about making space for new things to come in and allowing myself and my practice to grow and change. I don't want to ever feel like I have to keep a deck because I bought it if it doesn't resonate with me, even if it's an expensive deck or even if it's a rare out of print deck that I can't easily replace. I don't want to ever feel beholden to my tarot decks, and I don't want to be held prisoner by them either, because there are several decks that, for lack of a better term, I'm going to say I felt held prisoner by because they were rare or expensive or out of print, and I felt like if I moved them along, like I was going to regret that later, or if I did, it would kind of be too dang bad. And that's not a good feeling for me. I don't want to feel like my tarot decks are holding me hostage within my tarot collection. So some of the decks that I've been moving along have been decks that are in that category because they don't line up with my practice anymore. Or I've moved past them, or I feel like the work that I needed to do with them has been done. And I don't want to keep holding on to them because I feel obligated to because of the rarity or price or some other consideration beyond I just want to keep it, right? There are some decks that I have that, I paid a pretty penny for. We're going to take a look at one of them here in a moment. And I don't feel like I'm holding on to it because of the price tag attached to that deck or the rarity of it. I'm holding on to it because it is a deck that I genuinely feel connected to and that I am still actively working with. And so for me, that was kind of a big realization over the last couple of months as I've been kind of going through this process on my own. This is a process I've been doing for several months now, even though I've kind of only just recently started talking about it on my channel. Because again, a lot of it is very much in that feeling state, and I kind of need to go through my collection and look at where I'm at and how I'm feeling about things and what I want to do with my tarot practice. So one of the things that I like to look at, or how I approach this idea of kind of moving some decks along, is that it's making room for new things. And for me, my tarot collection and where my comfort level lies isn't with a certain number. There's not a magic number of decks that I feel comfortable keeping. I do have a certain space within my tarot room here, my office, and I do like to keep things kind of, manageable within that space for me. But again, there's not a magic number, and I could do any sort of reorganization techniques and have to either make space or rearrange or, create more physical space within my office to actually house more decks. And as long as that feels good and in alignment with my practice and where my growth path is going, I'm good with that. I don't mind making space for new decks. I don't mind moving along decks that aren't working for me. There's no magic number for me. There's no formula really to follow, even though I have tried many times to create one, because I like having a path to follow. I like having a formula to follow. I like having this, I need to do A, B, C, D, and then I will get to the answer that I want, right? It's kind of like a tarot reading. If I lay 3 cards, I'll get the answer I want. But as we all know, you don't always get the answer you want in those 3 cards. Sometimes they bring up even more questions. So I've kind of learned over the last couple months that it's more of a feeling thing for me. When I start to feel like I have too many decks that are not in alignment with my practice currently, or too many decks that I'm no longer working with, I want to move those out so that I can make space for new ones. And that is just a personal preference because I do have space. I could keep all the decks, every deck I've ever bought, I do have space for. I could move them into other rooms. I could have overflows. I could put them in other closets, right? I could make the space if I wanted to, but I don't want to. So we're not going to go into that. So that all being said, what I wanted to do today is kind of just share with you some of the new decks that I've brought into my collection over the last couple of months that I feel like have been space has been made for them because I have cleared out other things in my collection. Because we're all talking a lot about decluttering and culling and all of that right now, which to me is not unexpected, because I think a lot of us during the first part of the pandemic and certainly the last couple of years, we've been feeling out of sorts, and we are all just trying to navigate in this new space and try to figure out how do we work within this new set of norms. And when that comes to our tarot practice, that may mean bringing in new decks to explore because we are, in lockdown, or because we are unable to get out and do the things that we normally do. So we're going to dive deeper into various aspects of our practice, and that may mean bringing in new decks. It may mean, bringing in new decks because we're going to try different things. We're going to try different types of decks. And that doesn't necessarily mean that all of those decks that we may have accumulated during that time are decks that are going to stay in our collection forever. And I think as we're coming out to the other side and just trying to navigate this new norm that we're all in, we're all trying to find our way in this new space. And so I think it's natural for us to look at things like our tarot practices and our tarot collections and, other aspects of our life. I know I have done decluttering, not just in my tarot practice, but in pretty much every room of my home, because I'm kind of looking at things through fresh eyes now, and looking at things through a different perspective, because my life does not look like it did before the pandemic. The things that I do, the things that are important to me, the things that I focus in on have changed dramatically over the last couple of years, and it's reflected in my tarot journey as well. And I think that's just, again, a natural part of the evolution. But I think this recent kind of flow that we've seen of this sort of decluttering and culling and kind of looking at in our collection what works for us and what doesn't, I think that's just part of a collective energetic shift where we're all feeling like, okay, we are finally acknowledging that this is the way things are now, and we've all gone through this transition period, various different levels of it, but I don't know a single person who hasn't been affected by the things that have happened in the last couple of years. And I think it's only natural for us to want to take a look at where things are now and to make changes to help us integrate where we are now with the things that we are doing. And maybe we're trying to, bring back practices that we once had that we had to put on hold. And I think that's just part of the larger global conversation that is going on currently in our world, that life is never going to be the same, and now we're all just trying to adjust to the new normal. So I think that does mean for a lot of us that we're going to be moving some decks along, and we're going to be bringing new things in. So in a couple of videos last month, I really talked a lot about the things that we're leaving. Today, I want to talk about the things that I brought into my collection. This is not all the decks that I've bought in the last few months, but it's some of the key decks that I really wanted to tap into and share and talk about kind of why I feel like space has been made for them within my collection through my decluttering and culling process that I've been doing over the last few months. So the first deck we're going to start with is the Intuitive Night Goddess Tarot, and I do believe that all but one or two of these decks are all decks that you will have seen on my channel in the last couple of months, some just very, very recently in my monthly reflections. But one of the things that the Intuitive Night Goddess brought into my collection and into my tarot practice was a very specific connection to the divine and to my spirituality that I experienced through this deck. And by moving along other kind of goddess and divine feminine energy decks that I wasn't really connecting with, I felt like this deck had a place in my practice because I wasn't overly saturated in that particular area. Now, if I hadn't moved all of those decks along and I was looking at my tarot shelf and looking at the divine feminine sort of goddess energy decks, I would have seen that I had a ton of them. Like there was a whole pile of decks, and only about half of those I actually used. So I moved along the ones that I wasn't using, and then when I came across this deck, again, this isn't stuff that I set out to do, like I'm gonna rehome a bunch of goddess decks so that I can buy this one. That's not how my brain works. I buy this one, and it just happened that I had purchased it at around a time where I was moving on a bunch of goddess decks that I wasn't working with. So it's not like I'm trying to validate the purchase or that I'm trying to get stuff out so that I can bring this in. It isn't a one-for-one thing for me. And I know that some people do that as a practice. They will, bring in one deck and move one out. And I think that's really a very wonderful, very balanced approach to it. That's not my particular approach, which is totally fine. If I feel a deck resonates with me and I feel like it might bring some benefit to my practice, I will bring it in regardless of how many decks I have that are in alignment with that same energy. Because as the case with the Intuitive Night Goddess Tarot, I might find that newer deck actually works better than anything else that I have. So when I got this deck in, and this deck had such an immediate response for me, and I developed such a quick and deep connection with it, that I felt like that a lot of those decks that I had been moving along, a lot of the goddess decks that I wasn't working with that I moved along, I felt like they moved out so this deck could move in. Now, that I think all happened on a subconscious level because it wasn't something, like I said, I didn't set out to pull out all my goddess decks and say, okay, these are the ones I'm not working with because I want to bring this deck into my collection. It just so happened at the same time. But because I feel like I made space in my collection, this deck felt even more like at home and in alignment with the other decks that I have and the practices that I use these types of decks for. Hopefully that's making some sense. It is very hard to translate how you feel and how you experience your practice and your decks, as I've mentioned in many videos now. It's very hard to translate that and articulate that into words because it is very much a feeling. It's an energetic thing. It's a intuitive nudge. And as you probably know, that can be really hard to articulate. So I absolutely love the Intuitive Night Goddess. I've talked about it many, many times on my channel now over the last couple months. And it's a deck that I feel like really took the space of a lot of the goddess decks that I wasn't connecting with, and I kind of moved all those out, and then this singular deck came in and really slipped right into my practice in a very deep and meaningful way, and I connected with this deck much more than any of the others that I had in my collection previously. Now, if I had just taken a look and gone, oh, I don't need another goddess deck, which I have said to myself many times, you don't need another insert type of deck here. But if I had done that in this case, I would have completely missed out on this deck, which has been an absolutely treasured part of my practice now. And I have done a lot of really wonderful, deep spiritual work with this deck. And had I said, nope, I don't need another goddess deck, I would have totally missed the boat on that. So I'll try to move a little bit more quickly, otherwise we'll be here forever. The next deck that I want to talk about is the Wandering Star Tarot. And again, this is another deck that I have done videos on and have talked about on my channel in the last couple of months. Here's the backs. We're not really here to look at the decks, so to speak. So this deck is another case of, if I had taken a look at this deck and gone, it's another Rider-Waite-Smith deck. I don't need another Rider-Waite-Smith deck. And those words have come out of my mouth I don't know how many times over the last couple of years. I don't need another Rider-Waite-Smith deck. I don't actually really even read in total alignment with the Rider-Waite-Smith. And this deck, I was like, it has keywords and all that. If you watch the video on this deck, I was like, not sure at first. But again, had I let that I don't need another Rider-Waite-Smith deck mentality lock me into my own practice or hold me prisoner in my own practice, I would have never picked up this deck. And this deck has been really wonderful for self-care readings. I really love the energy and the art style. I find it very charming, very soothing. It's a very, very easy reader for me, so it's a wonderful one that I can pull out and work with when I'm kind of in a tender place. Now, I don't necessarily have any other decks that I moved out of my collection to make space for this deck, but what I did do was kind of shift my mentality and not lumping all decks together, because whether it's Rider-Waite-Smith based or Thoth based or Marseille based or Pip style, it's all tarot, right? So technically, do I even need more than one? And that's always a conversation that we have. In my opinion, I feel like I do need more than one because I use them for very specific things. But this is a case that if I had locked myself into the mentality of I don't need another Rider-Waite-Smith deck, I would have missed out on the experience of working with this deck, and I would have missed out on the experience to bond with it, to do the mod on it, to continue to use it as part of my self-care practice, to use it in readings when I'm feeling a little bit vulnerable or tender, and to let it be, you know, a wonderful addition to my tarot practice and my little sort of tarot family that I have going on here. So again, this is a case of like if I had kept myself locked into the idea or the mindset of I don't need another Rider-Waite-Smith, I would have missed out on this deck. Now I have moved out several Rider-Waite-Smith decks and, you know, moved them onto other homes because I have, as I said, I don't need a ton of them. However, when one catches my eye, the fact that it's a Rider-Waite-Smith based deck should not, in my opinion, deter me from checking it out if it's something that I legitimately feel drawn to, as in the case with the Wandering Star. So even though I have said, and like I said, I admit it, it's come out of my mouth before, I don't need another Rider-Waite-Smith. I don't even read Rider-Waite-Smith. All of that I try to tell myself to talk myself out of decks is ridiculous, in my opinion. Like, I don't even know why I do that to myself because it doesn't accomplish anything. It just makes me feel bad. And so this deck is a really wonderful example about not locking myself into that mindset, because there are things that I would miss out and opportunities that I would miss out on when I do that. So that's kind of a deck that kind of taught me over the last couple months that sometimes I do need another Rider-Waite-Smith deck. So let's talk about a couple of little Thoth or Thoth-inspired decks now, since we've gone the Rider-Waite-Smith route. This is the Hardy Tarot, and I did just real recently talk about this one because this was one of the decks that I worked with all throughout April. This deck has been one that's been on my list for a long time, but I was always like, oh, I think it's Thoth-based. Whether it is or isn't, it doesn't really matter. I enjoy it. But this is a really good example of if I was in that mindset of I have the Thoth, so I don't need another Thoth-based deck. Again, I would have missed out on the opportunity of working with this deck. And this deck, quite honestly, has been one of my favorites that I've been working with in the last month or so. It's been a really wonderful, powerful reader for me. I've done a lot of really wonderful work with it, and I really enjoy the kind of hybrid Thoth, RWS, numerological elemental kind of kitchen sink-ness-esque, however you want to say that, of this deck. To me, this deck is a beautiful blend of all of it, and I really, really enjoy working with it, and I love that a lot of the cards really do align with the way that I read tarot, which is very numerological and elemental at its base. And so if I had said to myself, I don't need another Thoth deck because I have the Thoth, I would have missed out on this experience and working with this deck, which quite honestly, I have worked with way more in the last month or so than I have the traditional Thoth. This artwork, this art style, this blending of the ideas and the systems and that really strong elemental and numerological backbone of this deck is really quite powerful for me and really in alignment with how I read. And so again, if I had said, nope, no more Thoth decks for me, this would have never come into my collection and I would have totally missed out on that experience as well. So speaking of Thoth decks, let's talk about the She-Wolf Tarot. Again, another deck that I have talked about multiple times in the last couple of weeks, but I don't care, y'all, because I love this deck. So the She-Wolf Tarot has been a deck that has been really key for me in working through some personal empowerment, let's say struggles. of really struggling to kind of tap into my own personal power in the last couple of weeks. And this deck has been like this beautiful kind of butt kick of a deck that I needed, that, you know, reminded me that I can be fierce, I can stand up for myself, I can put out what I feel I need to put out, I can share what I need to share, and I can do so with confidence. And this deck has been really key for that. Now, this is a deck that I went for a long time. It's Thoth. Again, we're circling back around to, do I need another Thoth deck? However, this deck, the imagery is totally different from Lady Frida Harris's artwork. So although it is based on the Thoth, like, it totally does its own thing, which I really appreciate. But really more, this was a case of, I would look at it and go, I like it, I'm drawn to it, but do I need another collage deck, right? Because I'm like, I have the Moonchild, I have the Star Child. By the way, these are completely different decks. I have the, you know, the Lioness, Oracle Tarot. I have the Dreamkeepers. Like, I have a ton of collage decks, but each of those has a very different energy and a very specific way that I work with the deck. And none of those decks that I've mentioned do I use for kind of that tapping into my own sort of fierce personal power. And that has been my experience with this deck, and it has come to me at a time when I really, really needed it. But again, if I had looked at my collection and looked at the boxes upon boxes of collage decks that I have on my shelf over here, I'd have gone, yeah, I don't really need it. And had I done that, I would have missed out on the experience of working with this deck and getting to know it and doing those really, really profound readings and doing that deep work that was actually quite healing, quite helpful, and I really needed at that time in my life. And I feel like a lot of times these decks just kind of come into my life, you know, when I need them. And I always think that's really wonderful. But if I had said no because I want to keep my decks to a certain number or whatever, like I wouldn't have bought it, and I would have missed out on that experience and that really deep work that I was doing and am still doing, to be perfectly honest. So that's the She-Wolf Tarot and kind of the story behind that one. So real quick, let's just touch on another collage deck. This is the Vision of the Muse Oracle, and this is a deck that I went back and forth about because I was like, I have the Lioness Tarot Oracle, right? They're by the same creator. They have the same type of art style. Rather than being a tarot, it's an oracle with keywords on the bottom. And I went back and forth on this because I was like, I love the Lioness and I would probably love the Vision of the Muse, but do I actually need it? Because I have the Lioness Oracle and because I do have other, you know, collage-based decks. But I kept feeling myself drawn to this deck and drawn to these keywords. And even though this is by the same creator as the Lioness Oracle and it has a similar energy, I get a totally different experience working with this deck. Because rather than seeing this collage work through the lens of the tarot, now I'm seeing it through the lens of her keyword. And it's a totally different experience, even though the artwork is very similar and it's, you know, of course, by the same person. And I can put this deck with the Lioness Oracle and still get a really beautiful, expansive reading because I'm able to tap into both the tarot energy through the Lioness and the keyword and imagery that I find in the Vision of the Muse. And so this has been a really wonderful one to kind of help me deepen and at the same time broaden my work with the Lioness Oracle and my work in those areas that I use that type of a deck, particularly when I'm feeling very creatively blocked. This is one of my favorite decks to go to. This and the Lioness Tarot and Tarot or Lioness Oracle Tarot. And I put those two together and I get this really beautiful in-depth reading that most often kind of points me in the direction of where I need to go and what I need to be doing. So again, this is another case of if I had said nope, because I have the Lioness, I don't need another deck by this creator, I would have missed out on the experience. And yeah, I sound like a broken record. That's like the gist of this video, right? That's the takeaway. If I had said no, I would have missed out on the deck, which is pretty much what I'm getting at. But I do just want to share, like, this is the new stuff. We talked about all the stuff that I'm like, I'm moving it along. So this is the stuff that I've brought in some senses as a replacement, but in some senses just to expand or enhance various aspects of my practice. So speaking of practices, this is the Priestess of the Light Oracle, and this is a deck that I fairly recently brought into my collection. And the funny thing, I just recently spoke about this deck in my favorites, and I think I did mention in that when I first saw this deck come out, I was like, oh, it's pretty, but I don't need it because I don't need another goddess deck, right? That was my reasoning behind not picking up this deck, even though I was drawn to it, even though I like the artwork. And maybe it is just one of those things of it just needed to be the right place and the right time for me. But I have, recently been doing my work with Isis, and I was working with the Isis Oracle, and that one was starting to really kind of fall flat for me in terms of the artwork, which I talked about in my monthly video, so we won't go into that here. And then when I finally realized that this deck actually represents the energy of working with Isis, is more resonant to that energy for me, then I went ahead and picked it up, and I was like kind of kicking myself for like, why did you wait so long? Because this deck has been so profound in my work in the last couple of weeks with Isis. It's just been so spot on and so in alignment with that work that I've been doing, way more so than I ever had with the Isis Oracle. And even though I do still have the Isis Oracle, 2 copies of it, in fact, the larger one in the pocket, and I don't really have any intentions of moving those along, I have brought this one in a sense to kind of replace the larger one in my devotional work with Isis, because this one feels like it is much more in alignment. And the readings and the work that I've done with this deck have been so much more powerful than I've ever experienced as I've started my work with that particular deity. So again, another example of if I had said no or continued to say no, because I did say no to this deck many, many times. I was like, I don't need another goddess deck. And then to come to find out that it actually does really resonate in a very specific and very profound way for me, and really slid into my practice in a way that the other deck hadn't quite hit for me. So this one kind of fit that space for me even better than what I currently had. So that was a really wonderful experience. But again, if I had continued to say no to it, as I have so many times in the past, I would have never known. Okay, so just a couple more decks that I want to share. This is the newest deck that I have purchased, and it's so funny because I talked about I hate these liminal 11 boxes. I think I talked about it in the in one of the purgatory decks, like the cardboardy thing, the box within the box, like it all annoys me. It all annoys me. And I moved or am moving the New Chapter Tarot, which was also the deck by Liminal 11, along because I was so frustrated with the cardstock. And here's the thing with this deck. So this is the Cosmic Slumber. I forgot if I had said that or not. This was a deck that I bought because I was having trouble sleeping, and I was having some really kind of profound and or really detailed, interesting dreams, and I wanted to explore that more. And the decks that I had in my collection they just weren't working. I didn't feel drawn to any of those to do that kind of work. None of them felt right, if that makes sense. And so I came across this one actually one night when I was having trouble sleeping, and I was like, the Cosmic Slumber Tarot, maybe that would work to help me connect with doing some dream work. And I went back and forth about it because I'm like, it's Liminal 11. And I'm sorry to Liminal 11 and anybody who loves them, but I do not like their boxes. I do not like their cardstock. Their production value of their decks, while it is perfectly lovely, does not resonate with me personally. And so I tend to stay away from their decks. But if I had used that blanket experience to determine whether or not I was going to purchase this deck, right? If I had let my experience with the New Chapter, where I was like, I was uncomfortable. Like, I didn't like the cardstock. And quite honestly, and I can't remember if I actually mentioned this in the Purgatory video, but the few readings that I did do, the few card pulls and very small readings that I did do with that deck fell really, really flat for me. And I've never been drawn to one of this particular publisher's decks. Like, I appreciate them all. I think they're all beautiful in their own way, but they were never decks that I wanted to work with. So all of that is going on in the back of my mind when I'm looking at this deck going, it's by that same creator, that same publisher that I don't like their cardstock, I don't like their boxes. Their decks never resonate with me. I've moved several of them along now. But if I had let that kind of stop me in my tracks and not move forward, I would have not purchased this one. And it turns out this deck has actually been really, really helpful in doing my dream work. I don't know if it's like the colors or the artwork or the fact that it is kind of meant to take place in this cosmic sort of dream-like world. I've been able to really do some deep work and unpack some crap in my, coming through my dreams that I wasn't able to do with the other decks that I was trying to use it for that particular work. But again, if I had let those experiences with the New Chapter Tarot and the other Liminal 11 decks that I've had along the way, if I had let all those experiences stop me in my tracks, I would have never picked up this one. And I think that to me just goes to show, like, me personally, that I need to like not be a snob against certain decks or certain creators or certain publishers when I feel called to work with the deck, right? If it's a deck where I'm like, I don't really care for that publisher's, their cardstock or their books or their boxes or whatever it is, and I'm also not feeling drawn to the artwork, then that's a totally different story. But when it's a deck like this where I'm like, yeah, I kind of feel it with this artwork and I feel like it would really work well for what I'm trying to accomplish right now. If I had let all of my past experiences with this particular publishing company in my work with their decks in the past stop me from purchasing this one, again, I would have missed out on the experience of being able to do that dream work that was eventually helpful, and I was able to kind of work my way through some things. So this to me was a really good lesson. I'm still not a huge fan of this cardstock either, but it isn't, I think because it's longer and thinner than the New Chapter Tarot, I can shuffle it, so there is that. This still annoys the crap out of me, so it's getting a bag at some point. I just haven't had time to make one. But to me, this is a really good reminder to myself to like not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And just because I haven't liked something by a particular publisher, creator, or whatever, doesn't mean that that's always going to be the case for me. So that was a really good lesson for me with this Cosmic Slumber Tarot. The Animal Tarot by, of course, Doreen Virtue, and this one happens to be Radleigh Valentine. This deck is out of print now, and it can be hard to get, and it can go for stupid amounts of money. I got a fairly decent deal on this deck. But if I had let the fact that it is a Doreen Virtue deck, because that's a thing, right? And like, I don't have to agree with a creator's point of view in order to appreciate their deck. And I should have pulled the Thoth out, because there is no deck that has taught me that lesson as powerfully or impactfully as the Thoth Tarot, because that is a deck that I don't agree with most of what Aleister Crowley has to say about the world, and even some of the things that he says about his own deck. Like, they are not in alignment. His values are not in alignment with mine. But I can appreciate what he's doing in his deck. I really like Lady Frida Harris's artwork, and the deck works well for me. So that's a case where I can separate the deck from the person. And I know that that's not something that everybody wants to do, and I totally respect that. But for me personally, when it comes to working with Doreen Virtue decks, of which I do have several, this is a case where I can disconnect Doreen Virtue from this deck, and I can just read it as a way, as a deck that it works for me in the way that it works for me. This is a deck that I purchased right around the time that we had to put our our dog down, and there's a lot of dogs in this deck. And this was a deck that I actually ended up using for kind of some healing and grief work during that time, to kind of work through, you know, losing a member of our family. He'd been with us for a very long time. And this was the deck that I ended up turning to for that work. I liked that it had the really soft, kind of cute animals. It has really wonderful kind of affirming messages on the card. And because it was an animal deck, because I do have other decks by Radleigh Valentine that have the messages on them too, and they're all usually very affirmative and very positive and happy. But because this one was an animal deck one, it felt very tuned into that particular grief work that I was doing, you know, losing a pet. But again, if I had, you know, let the fact that this was a Doreen Virtue deck stop me from getting it, then, you know, I would have missed out on that experience. Sure, I could have found another deck in my collection to do that work with, but this was really helpful, and it was definitely a deck that I will use again for probably various similar, you know, readings of that nature. Not necessarily grief work, but when I'm feeling maybe a little bit tender, or I need a little bit of this cute supportive animal energy, this will definitely be the deck that I go to for that now. Okay, well, let's just go with that. I'm missing the Hardy, the poor Hardy, but there's just no room for it. So yeah, if I had let all of those reasons that I kept trying to tell myself that I didn't need these decks for those particular reasons, I would have missed out on the whole experiences of these decks. And so that's kind of just what I thought would be great to sit down and chat about today. We talk a lot about decluttering decks and making smaller collections and being really mindful about our purchases, which all I think is very important things to keep in mind when you're looking at curating your deck collection, particularly if, you know, you're looking at things like budgets and space and really kind of hard lines on things that you just have to keep in mind when you're working with and purchasing and buying decks. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that new decks do bring new things to our collection and to our practice. And if we're constantly saying no all the time because I have an RWS, or because I don't read Thoth yet, or because it's by a certain person, or because you have several decks that already do this thing, right? For me, sometimes that makes me feel like it's putting everything in a box, and it's kind of limiting how I can experience new decks being put out. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope the spirit in which I am intending this video, which is, you know, yes, culling is good, decluttering is good, especially with, you know, if you're in a position where you don't feel good about your particular tarot practice or your particular deck collection. But experiencing new things is good too, and not being so rigid in your, and when I say your, I'm talking about me, and if it applies to anybody else, fantastic. But not being so rigid in my lines, in my rules that I've set up for myself, and not saying you can't buy another RWS deck because you have enough as it is. You can't buy another Liminal 11 deck because you didn't like any of the others, right? If I am not so rigid with that thinking, and I let my deck collection and my practice and the decks that I bring into my collection flow with where my tarot practice is going, then that to me feels more in alignment than a magic number of decks that I have. So I just wanted to share that, kind of the balance to the, you know, let's take a look at all of the decks that I'm getting rid of. I wanted to spend some time and take a look at some of the new decks that I brought in, and kind of why and what I feel that they have brought to my collection. Again, most of these are decks we've seen and we've talked about, but I felt like having the balance to that was important. I felt like acknowledging the fact that, you know, decluttering is great, but so is curating your collection in a way that is in alignment with your own personal practice and the things that you are doing. You know, a year ago, I wasn't working with Isis, so this deck probably wouldn't have had the impact that it did this last month. And, you know, I wasn't working with the Thoth in the last year. And so having decks that were Thoth based wouldn't have ever even entered my collection. And I think for me, that's just really shown me personally how my practice ebbs and flows. And for me, that's okay. Because again, there isn't like a magic number. It's more of just, if I feel that it's going to bring something to my practice, then that's something that I want to honor and I want to go ahead and explore it. And if it doesn't work out, I can move it along. And if it does, then great, I have a new deck that I can use in that particular practice. So that was kind of just what I wanted to share today. This is kind of the other end of the spectrum, right? I decluttered a bunch of decks, but I also bought a bunch of decks too, because I felt like the decks that I moved out of my collection were no longer serving a purpose for me. And the new decks that I have brought into my collection all have found a very deep and profound place in my practice. Now, whether that will be the case for long term with these decks, or these are decks that are maybe just here for a reason or a season, remains to be seen. But I have really enjoyed the experience of getting to know them and to seeing how they have become a part of my collection. And again, if I had said no from the get-go, we wouldn't even be here. So thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to sharing with you again soon.